he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
Well, I mean, there's this sort of simple task of like, when there's this much horror on your TV every night, how do you scare somebody? Like, what is terrifying? What is nightmare inducing in a world in which that much death and destruction, that much, you know, that much social and cultural upheaval, the assassinations, the footage of civil rights marches being, attempted to be put down by the police, and all this state violence and violence against the state and state-sponsored violence and war. How do you stand out in that sort of visual culture? If you want to know what it felt like to live in America in 1968, Night of the Living Dead is as good an expression of that as any other artifact of the era. George Romero would always, throughout his life, insist that he never intended for Ben to be a black character, that Dwayne Jones showed up and just happened to be the best actor for the role, which is absolutely true. But at the same time, you don't cast a black actor who has that ending, who is a hero who punches a white patriarch in the face and then shoots him, without realizing that it has some kind of meaning for the larger culture. It's with his future films, George would work towards making a more focused social critique, but there's something about the original Night of the Living Dead that just expresses that chaotic sense of violence and despair, the sort of apocalyptic feeling that living in the late 1960s, at a time when, there were these just like horribly deflating assassinations and the footage on the news of, atrocities and war and uncertainty. And it feels more like Night of the Living Dead than it does like, I don't know, In the Heat of the Night, also from 1968, a film that is explicitly about racial conflicts. There's no film that feels more kind of emotionally grueling or exhausting than Texas Chainsaw Massacre, unless it's Last House on the Left. They are horror films, which Night of the Living Dead is to a certain degree, but they're horror films that are kind of less interested in the sort of fun monster scares that make you, scream and then laugh about it with your friends and because you spilled your popcorn or whatever. Then it is about just this sense of exhaustion. Like, there's so much horror, it just keeps going. If you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a strangely structured movie where nothing really happens for 30 or 40 minutes, and then bang, 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 some people get chainsawed. And then the last 30 or 40 minutes is Sally screaming. And it goes at a certain point from the viewer being scared for Sally, scared that somebody's going to pop out and get her, to just feeling emotionally drained at having to maintain this level of, of terror that just lasts for so long in that movie. And I think that it's, as much as the imagery seems to come from and reflect a culture that's seeing those sorts of images on TV and reports from Vietnam, to me it's that feeling that's most important, this sense of like, when will the horrors stop? I mean, in part, that's kind of a delayed response to Psycho. And, I mean, to a certain extent, like, the other films that come out around 1960, like Eyes Without a Face and Peeping Tom, which are films that declare the scariest thing not to be a monster from far away who looks immediately like a threat, but a adorable boy next door type who lives at a nondescript motel that could be, could be interchangeable with hundreds of other motels around the country. Though what's scary is that the monstrosity is hiding inside a rather normal looking person. And it's with that shift that you start to see a sort of different conception of horror, not as something that comes from far away, but that as something that might be there among you. It's something that seems fitting for a country trying to wrestle with its own guilt, its own complicity in, the violence of the civil rights struggle in Vietnam. I mean, even in Watergate and the assassinations and in all of that, this is all horror that's homegrown. We don't need an old world aristocrat to scare us, to be the monster that arrives on our shores. As far as gender and sexuality in the horror film goes, it's complicated, to say the least. Horror films are a vehicle for, more heroic women, more women who talk to each other, who have like actual characters and roles than almost any other genre, with the exception of like the romantic comedy, basically. But especially in the 1980s, there is an aspect of both eroticization of violence towards women and a kind of punishment of especially sexual transgression. As I said, it's complicated. There is a sense in which the sexuality of female victims is, the association of that with danger is also just kind of expressing anxieties that the presumably young audience would be feeling. The discussion of the slasher film as this kind of anti-feminist or anti-woman genre, or what Siskel and Ebert call like the woman in danger film, there's undoubtedly merit to that. It's an expression of a like very misogynist kind of era. Go back and watch any comedy, and the number of like jokes about sexual assault and that sort of thing are kind of staggering to 2019 eyes. And in a lot of ways, the slasher movies are just kind of they're just kind of expressions of that. But I think that the most productive way to think about it is as this complicated expression of anxieties that can take a variety of different approaches. It can adopt different positions depending on the film. You mentioned Halloween, which is a film that was co-written by a woman, Deborah Hill, who's a fantastic screenwriter, and who really focuses on the relationships between the female friends who are at the center of it. And it's certainly true that Jamie Lee Curtis, that Laurie Strode, her character, is the is the more virginal, bookish one. But that is a film that values her character, that never sexualizes her, and that, as much as the kind of association between sex and punishment can validly be read into the scenes of her friends being killed, her friends are very likable people, and I like, as characters, they're fun, and the actresses are, give these like fun, phenomenal performances. I don't want to just sort of discount or paper over the effort, successful effort that went into making them human beings that you care about. On the other hand, there's plenty of slashers where, killing a woman in the shower or after sex or whatever seems to be an excuse to, show boobs on screen, and to kind of combine two sensationalist kind of spectacles in one. But, I've always had a surprising number of female students who are into slasher movies. This is not necessarily to claim that there's any kind of like feminist intention behind them, but that they do offer more female characters than the horror genre had previously, than than other kinds of genres very often do, and they talk about gender relations, and they talk about, in some ways, like the misogyny of the culture and the kind of basic sadism of like images in the culture in a frank, if not fully conscious way that I think resonates with a lot of viewers. Another way of understanding the 80s, by the way, which is the decade of Tom Savini and Rob Bottin and Chris Wallace and all of these just amazing special effects artists who work with people like George Romero and David Cronenberg and on the Friday the 13th movies, and make these movies that are dedicated to really kind of deranging and tearing apart the human body. And that really becomes the appeal of the genre in the 1980s more than monsters. You still have your Freddys and Jasons and Michael Myers and all that. You look at old fan magazines, and it's the it's the gory spectacle that is the fold-out poster as often as it is, Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger or something like that. This is the decade in which the body becomes central to American and to some degree Western culture in a way that it really hadn't before. The action heroes are roided up and shirtless and just showing off these awesome muscular physiques, and aerobics videos are everywhere, and the idea of trying to achieve a perfect body through regular exercise and through going to a gym and aerobics or whatever is mainstream for really, like, in a way that it never had been before. And, you know, mainstream movies really express that to an almost ridiculous degree. Horror movies show the underside of that. Like, they're the opposite of perfect bodies. They're showing, you know, mutated and, you know, gross and evolving kinds of bodies, and then tearing them up. You know, the kind of anxiety over physique just is like exploded in, you know, like in Tom Savini's work, you know, in something like Maniac, or the stuff he and Greg Nicotero did in George Romero's Day of the Dead, where they literally tear a dude in half. It's gross, but it's also this kind of like, I don't know, freeing spectacle that's declaring like the perfect body to be something that the genre is not interested in.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
I mean, you know, the interesting thing is that none of those films were hits. You know, They Live in Society both kind of thudded on impact, as much as I adore both of them. I think one of the reasons why they didn't hit with audiences was because they were kind of saying the quiet parts loud. They were expressing something that's sort of inherent to the genre in the 1980s that maybe audiences weren't ready to think about in explicit terms. So this disreputable genre is always enacting a kind of attack on the mainstream, on the quote-unquote normal people. You know, it's sending escaped inmates and, you know, dream demons and, you know, drowned children after the young, privileged, and pretty people who, you know, are kind of the poster boys and girls for the American dream. And it's so savage in the 1980s, you know, this time when suburbia really becomes the locus for horror. It's a time in which the, you know, like, white picket fence house in the suburbs is no longer safe. And there's, as always, the kind of like xenophobic, racist and misogynist and, you know, whatever else, transphobic anxieties that are being expressed, but there's also this kind of fantasy sense of wanting to tear it all down, you know, of wanting to attack the representatives of this, you know, like ideologically objectionable, elitist sort of mainstream that requires you to make a bunch of money and, you know, get married and start having kids and that sort of thing. I wish there was more yuppie horror from the 80s. It's a little too new for the filmmakers in the 80s to really latch onto in like a meaningful way. You know, the sort of fear of Weasley Wall Street types, it starts to show up more in like the 2000s. The idea of there being a powerful, rich person, you know, who's controlling all of this. I find American horror in the 90s to be less interesting than most other decades. There are good movies that are made, but, you know, like at the end of the decade we get The Sixth Sense and Blair Witch Project, which point the way forward for what horror would do in the 2000s. But, you know, as much as a hit as Scream was, it's kind of using a very Tarantino-esque, reference-heavy commentary on the genre to basically just do the genre again. You know, it's an attempt to reinvigorate the teen slasher movie with, you know, a bunch of jokes about slasher movies. And, you know, I love that, but it was a formula that grew stale very quickly. What resulted from the success of Scream was another teen slasher cycle. I don't know that I see any deep resonances with the culture in a lot of those movies, but clearly they're telling us something. They're telling us something about, you know, like, these are films in which it's not just that, like, teens are being terrorized, but in which the children themselves are monsters, that they're the killers, and there's something scary about kids, about these kids who grew up privileged and in the suburbs and all that. Anybody could be a killer. Well, in, you know, Scream and the post-Scream universe, you know, it's not just anybody. It's very specifically high school kids. It's in the 1990s where the most important films are coming out of Japan, like The Ring and The Grudge. Those are the films that are hugely influential, like, for, you know, the future of the genre, and that are hits around the world, much more so than, I don't know, I Know What You Did Last Summer or something like that. Those films are fascinating. The fact that they feel so specifically Japanese, but resonate with audiences all over the world. Like, if you watch the original Ring, there's so much very specific Japanese folklore in it, but the anxiety that it expresses over telephones and videotapes, and the kind of inherent creepiness of what would become like digital culture, just is really powerful, regardless of whatever sort of like mythic backstory that it has. Some very smart critics and scholars have said things along the lines of watching a horror film, analyzing a horror film is like putting a culture on the psychoanalytic couch. That looking at a horror movie just sort of, it puts on display the anxieties of a culture. It's not necessarily, you know, authoritative or totalizing. It's always partial and usually contradictory, like the kinds of fears and anxieties that are being expressed. They don't add up to, you know, like a kind of allegorical, consistent statement. But they tell you a lot about what people were afraid of at the time. And that doesn't depend on a filmmaker making a conscious statement. You know, the implications of gender non-normativity of Norman Bates was not in Alfred Hitchcock's mind in those terms. It's not what his screenwriters were thinking about. But one of the things that made Norman Bates so terrifying to audiences in 1960 was this idea that he was just tearing apart the kind of rigid binaries of gender in a way that marked him as monstrous, that marked him as different and weird and threatening that made him a danger to the culture as much as he was to Marion Crane. The implications of a horror film's fears, of what's scary about a horror film, aren't always clear at the time, but they're there. There's really no way of escaping it. The monster, the threat, is always marked by the culture, especially if it's successful.